Let's split this into two chunks, east and west. So the east side, the I-35 corridor, that's the NAFTA superhighway. The Texans have been very aggressive at expanding their manufacturing footprint and their draw for their supply chains to include Tulsa and Oklahoma City because they need more population, and that's the only direction to go. You move north of Oklahoma, though, you're in a different world. The Twin Cities are the most isolated major metro that we have, and Iowa is largely rural or a small town. There's only so much you can do with that. It's demographically stable. It's one of the demographically youngest parts of the country outside of Utah. But it's really not well hooked up into anybody else's systems. And I have a hard time seeing the Iowans and the Minnesotans changing their local culture to attract outside investment. And I say this as an Iowan. We have a very field of dreams approach to development. If you build it, they will come, and we shouldn't talk about it. It's because that would be, rude. So I see no reason to expect those two states to not be stable, but I also don't expect them to experience any sort of outsized growth. The Great Plains, it's just a question of whether or not the local political leadership decides to go out and get something. Obviously, infrastructure is difficult because of the distances, but as you move closer to the Front Range, you start to get integration with the mountains, and you start to get access to the Denver and the Albuquerque population centers. And so you have the widest variety imaginable in economic development and real estate in the Great Plains of any other part of the country. And so anything that I tell you that is true for one population center is going to be radically wrong for the other one. But they all have kind of two general thoughts. Number one, you link in with a major metro. The Front Range, kind of like the Texans, has a labor shortage, and they will draw from wherever they can get it. Second, we're now getting Zoom communities throughout this entire area. People who not necessarily are relocating from New York City to South Dakota, but people who are in South Dakota who don't want to move to New York can all of a sudden still work for a New York company.
Right.
And we're getting these little clusters that we used to only see up and down the eastern seaboard popping up all over the Mountain West and all over the Great Plains, where you can have small little clusters of workers who just telecommute. It's a very different economic model. It's difficult to know just how rich of a process this is going to be, but something to consider. Baby boomers are retiring. They're the ones who love offices. Gen X is taking their place. Gen X hates going into the office. So all of a sudden, the people who are in charge of deciding work schedules and what to invest in commercial real estate have, as a generation, turned against the entire asset class. Everything you hear about California when it comes to regulation and cost is true. There's limited land that you can do things with on the coasts. Sure, there's lots of land that's flat in the Central Valley, but it's all agriculture, and it's not exactly a migration magnet for people who are in high value-added industries. So all the land that is available in California pretty much has already been grabbed. You will have communities on the edge of, say, the Los Angeles basin that are going to try new things as the population matures and ages and becomes more skilled, because in that sort of environment of rising labor costs, it makes sense to move someplace where you might be able to mitigate the land cost. So on the fringes of greater LA, I can see a lot of growth activity happening, and I think we're seeing that. But the population story for California is over. For the last 20 years, the population growth, the population stability that we've seen in California has been because of a very finely tuned balance. The Californians who have been there for a generation or more are moving out, and a new generation is moving in. And so in-migration has kept the numbers from falling.
Yeah.
But the same urbanization and depopulation push that hit the Europeans 60 years ago hit the Mexicans 25 years ago. And Mexico's population is now stalling. And Mexico's ability to send people north of the border is ending. And if you add in the baby boomer retirement, California is probably looking at decades of depopulation moving forward. Now, not catastrophic and not rapid, but everything that is true about California from a cost point of view now has to layer in higher labor costs at the low and the high end simultaneously. And that is going to put pressure, more pressure, building pressure on them each and every year moving forward.
No.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the great things about California is despite everything that the state government consistently gets wrong, people still want to live there. And so if you can take actions at the margins to remove some of those barriers, you will have an outsized impact. It's a lot of low-hanging fruit that California can address should it choose to. Now, I don't want to predict that they're going to choose to do it, because this is a state that has spent 90 years trying to get a meaningful rail connection between the northern and the southern half of the states and still hasn't been able to pull it off. I mean, this is like 1870s levels of urban planning that California just can't wrap its mind around. But each individual tiny little, and from the point of view of everyone else in the country, incremental, almost infinitesimal improvement, you can do a lot. They just need to do it. I see Oregon and Washington, at least the western part where the major population centers are, as the next California. And I don't mean that in a good way. The amount of land that they have to work with is even lower, and they are a much more rapidly aging population, which makes it even more difficult for anything to happen. So just when you're dealing with issues like coding, civic code, not coding, it's, in my opinion, even more intractable when you're talking greater Portland or greater Seattle. Now, if you move to the other side of the mountains, into the interior, and you kind of have an echo of what's going on in the Great Plains.
Talk about places like Yakima and Bend.
Yeah, and Tri-Cities. These are very rapidly growing places. They've got high quality of life. They benefit from the infrastructure of urban-dominated states who still splash the money on the rural regions. They're physically beautiful. The weather is reliably good. So just like in California, you can have this split between an urban core that is wrestling and losing when it comes to the major changes going on, and some smaller population centers that most people don't really think about. So like Tri-Cities might be the Sacramento of Washington, if you will, that actually have a ridiculously complex cultural scene locally and are very rapidly growing urban areas. Sure, one is demographic, one is financial. On the demographic side, the same thing that's happening in the United States with the retirement of the baby boomers is happening in the wider world. But what is unique about the American baby boomers is they actually had kids. So we've got the millennials, which are a large generation, which are providing a lot of consumption and ballast. That doesn't exist in most of the rest of the world. No one else's boomers really had children. So when they move into retirement, they take their paychecks and their labor with them. A lot of these places are going to hollow out. And if you're a boomer in that environment and you have the money, you're going to try to leave, because the services won't be there, the tax base won't be there, the government activity isn't going to be there, and you're looking at general economic degradation on a broad scale that we have not seen as a species in well over a century and a half. That's kind of piece one. Piece two, if you're a government in this environment and your tax base is hollowing out and global trade's going away, your only real option left is to print currency to pay the bills. So we're having massive capital flight, not just from the boomers looking for a safer spot, but for anyone who can grab a chunk of those flows and get it to some place that's a little bit more stable. And in 9 cases out of 10, that more stable location is the United States. So we have seen over the last 10 years an accelerating flow of funds and people at the top end from the wider world to the United States. I expect that to double and triple in the next few years. End of the world is just the beginning. The whole idea is to show what the world is going to look like in deglobalization. So all of these structures and all this trade that we've become used to in manufacturing and finance and agriculture, it's all going away in the next few years. So the book's process, the book's topic is to figure out what is next. What does our world look like when it's no longer connected? Well, the original plan was for the world to fall apart in a more or less sedate schedule over the course of a decade, but COVID has just thrown that plan into the blender. We're now looking at manufacturing supply chains, relations with the Chinese, the European common currency, everything basically breaking down in a much more accelerated process. There are very few parts of the world that can function without an overarching American security presence. And between the Trump and the Biden administrations, that is now completely gone. And COVID has removed any sympathy that Americans might have had towards the wider world. And so we're honestly just kind of marking time for the first big international crisis where the Americans just stand back. And as soon as that happens, a lot of this connecting material that allows our world to function just snaps. And then we see where the chips fall.